All right, folks. So welcome to the Right to Publish webinar on clarity and concision. Today, we're going to talk about communication and rhetoric really quickly. By the way, those are huge areas of study, and we're going to blow past them very quickly. But we're going to do that to be able to get to how it is that we create kind of clarity and concision, that kind of organizing and flow at the macro level. We'll go to the sentence level. We'll talk about some principles of concision. Um, we'll talk about some fit tips from the writer's diet, but we'll see. We were talking earlier, and I don't know how much of the later tips are going to be useful. And so what we might do is just kind of stop at that point and then open it up for some conversation. Just as a reminder, if you're submitting to Canvas this week, 2 tasks, 1 submission. It's a short list of your editing plans. It's nothing that you have to have had done already. Or if you've already edited, what did you do kind of list. And then what have you edited or planned to edit at the sentence level in your article. And that could be anything about sentence bloat and kind of that wordiness, redundancies, a reminder about modifiers, and we'll talk about some of those in greater depth today. Needless words, that verbosity, that kind of like where you just kind of keep explaining and going on, but you probably don't need to continue explaining. And then those complex terms that are not grounded. Usually we talk about that in terms of jargon. And if you're using terms that are specialized terms with a purpose, they're not jargon. They're important. So when we're editing for clarity and concision, we need to keep in mind our reader. And so that's going to bring forward some just basic communication reminders. And I'm going to go super broad with this. I'm going to take us to the science of people and thinking about good communication skills broadly. So these are things that you can take with you into your presentations, to other places. And then we'll start connecting that then to some examples with proposals and with article writing. And just the first reminder is keep it simple. I know that many of us have heard this before, or the keep it simple and then the KISS method, right? But so that's how we're going to approach just our general reminders for good communication for researchers and academics. And I like these images. You can find them all over as open source images of where it is that you have a lens. We started off, of course, with the kind of like the focal lens and looking at a camera lens. But you can also think about glasses. And I like this one in part because it's like the forest for the trees. Like if everything's like this big forest and you're kind of there. And I think that's what you wind up with your first draft of something, is that you've just got so much and it all becomes a little blurry or not clear. I've also heard it described as an elephant, right? Everything becomes gray, that you can't really, it's so much there. And then gradually through that process of creating clarity and concision, right, that you bring a focus to your project. And so oftentimes you will find that in that editing process, it's not just editing words that are the redundancies or as we were talking about them structurally, it's actually a fine tuning of your own understanding of your project so that you can communicate it more clearly to your readers. And a great tip is if you can have that first sentence, and we talked about this with kind of arrangements before, and looking at your having your first sentence be that kind of gripping sentence, the one that grabs the reader, and that could be for any paragraph, could be for your whole piece. But if you can, with your titles and with your introductions and within each, at the beginning of each paragraph, kind of keep the flow of those ideas so that the reader's eye lands on those, really helpful for them. But the first sentence, if you can get across your argument, so it's got your subject, it's got the narrowed down into the topic area that you're talking about, and narrowed down into your perspective or the argument or the point that you're trying to make. If you could have all of that within one statement at the beginning of a document, you've pretty much got your proposal audience already hooked. You've got your readers of your article already there. They like know what you're talking about. And then it's the unfolding of that explanation that kind of pulls them through. And to get to that point, though, again, thinking forest through the trees, it takes a lot of effort to be able to get to the place where you get that one sentence. So if you're trying for that one sentence, I'll be curious to hear how how many of you do that, or if that's something that works for you. But it can take a long time. I had a senior writer, well known in the field, talking in a writing group today, who said that it took him 5 years to get to that one sentence in a proposal. So that's 5 years of conversation to get to one sentence. All right. And I think when we're editing for clarity and concision, it can look a lot like, oh my goodness, it's just everything gets so messy, and how do we keep track of it? And so that's its own kind of forest. It seems like we're creating clarity, and we might not be. There are some tools that you can use. The writer's diet is a one that we can talk about a little bit more in depth. I think that we've talked about it in here already. But what I like about the writer's diet, and these are just some reminders, and if there's something that you want me to cover in greater depth, please let me know in the chat, or for those of you who are watching, you'll just have to email me and we can have a conversation later. But verbs, nouns, prepositions, adjective, adverbs, and then it, this, that, and there. According to the kind of structure of the writer's diet by Helen Sword, you can identify how flabby, how big and kind of messy your work is by whether you have weak verbs or strong verbs, if you have jargony nouns versus expressive clear nouns, whether you are using prepositions or how many prepositional phrases you're kind of linking together and trying to have your reader hold on to. Adjectives and adverbs, if you have a lot of different adjectives, and which, by the way, ChatGPT loves its modifiers. It just kind of fills in, it keeps adding in like unnecessary, honestly, adjectives and adverbs. These are all our parts of speech. And so if you're not super familiar with them, you don't need to be in order to kind of figure out the color coding here. And what I like about the writer's diet is you can attach it to your own writing. And talked about this before, but it allows for you to be able to see subjects and verbs, for example, and nouns. So if you have weak verbs, is and are, was and were, those generally are indicators that your sentences are going to be longer, messier, and require that the reader kind of dig through a little bit more sometimes to find out the point of that you're trying to make. I was in graduate school and realized at one point that I had verb trouble. And so I focused on that, and I spent some time looking at, okay, so what are the most common verbs that I'm using? And it's usually the is, the was, the were, maybe have. I use a lot of have even still to this day, or has, right? But in order to be able to show action, you have to have something that is like the reader can see the action happening. And so in those verbs where that drive the action of the sentence, if you can identify what the challenges are, super helpful. Another place it's easy to identify where you might be going awry with on the page is it, this, that, and there. And these are placeholder pronouns, except for there. But these three, it, this, and that, presumably are referring back to something or connecting to something. And it's, if you're not doing that connection for the reader, readers can get confused. The sentences might sound like they make sense, but they just start to get a little wonky. So here, the periphery as we see it, it places the emphasis on what partial perception. So in this place where we have double it, the reader has to track it as we see what? Is it the participation? Is it the peripherality? Or is it something else? So in this case, it's actually just a general kind of existential it. So I highly recommend Helen Sword's Writer's Diet, and you can just pop it in and use the online tool, or you can add it to your Microsoft Word. Going to that kind of big, broad sense of communication and guidance for clarity and concision, this comes from the Science of People. It's by, oh my goodness, Veronica, Valerie, I'm blanking on her name. I've got her book someplace right above me. If I can find it quickly, I will let you know. Science of People. Nope, I'm not seeing it. Vanessa Edwards. There we go. So Vanessa Edwards started a nonprofit and looking at the science of people. It's not an academic program or site, but what she does is a lot of advising for businesses and how it is that they might be able to work with people and in relationship with each other better. And so this comes from their 7 C's of communication, which I really like. The clarity and conciseness, that's what we're here talking about. If I've mentioned in the past that clarity and concision are the top kind of qualities of a piece of writing that editors at journals or even your faculty advisors are looking for, that is true. That's presuming that you have all your content there too. You want to be able to make sure that you have something to communicate. Your message should be important as well. But after that, it should be clear and it should be concise so that you're not impinging on your reader or asking your reader to do too much work. And that is also a cultural thing. I know that in many other cultures, you might give your reader just enough so that then they can become curious, so that they might be the people who then also contribute some information or knowledge. And so they have everything spelled out for your reader. Actually, culturally, it might not be the case. I know that, for example, Chinese scholars, that's one of the challenges that they face in writing for English journals, English language journals, is that everything needs to be structured out in very clear and concise ways that culturally might not be part of their practice. That concreteness, it's just a reminder. I'm here to use vivid pictures of what it is that you're speaking about. If you're using good, solid nouns, and we'll take a look at some examples in a bit, then your reader can picture what it is that you're talking about. The correctness, goes to what we talk about as accuracy and also precision with our language. If you are in any field in academe, you understand that it's important for you in creating new knowledge that you be accurate and precise, so that others who come along and read your work can also build off of your work. Otherwise, it becomes wonky. And you can think about the discipline of engineering as being a space where you can see that very visibly at work. Sometimes, like in the very structures that engineers would have to be putting together, that kind of clarity and concision is related then to their accuracy and the precision, the correctness by which they're putting together their writing. It needs to be coherent, it needs to be understandable, complete, so full enough. And that's one of the things I think that we all struggle with as experts or budding experts in our field, that how do we take everything that we know about a topic and then kind of make sure that it's focused, it's clear, but it's also complete, that we haven't left anything out that's key or important. And so oftentimes we rely on others, we rely on our faculty advisors or colleagues to say, this just seems to be an extra point, and I don't think it's necessary for what the work that you're doing here. And then that may be in a whole other project, right? Once you take that out in your paper. This last one on courtesy, I like this and heavily endorse it in academic writing as well. We know that peer review gets a bad rap in part because, particularly with blind peer review, that comments can come back, and the presumption is that the peer reviewer, in being anonymous, no longer has to be so courteous, right? And take care with how they're framing things. They can just be kind of quick and dash off comments that can be quite hurtful. So the fear of the hostile reader in academia is quite real. Jolie Jensen talks about that a fair amount. But I think if we're courteous, if we're open and honest in that kind of friendly conversation, recognizing that something may not be perfect, recognizing that you either might be getting feedback from a reviewer who is saying, this is not the journal for you, your article, or this may not be an article yet that is ready for publication. So we need you to revise and resubmit. That can all be done with very friendly kind of tones. Sometimes it's not. All right. So those 7 C's of communication, just put them in your back pocket. It's something they're real simple for you to hang on to. And if you want the handout, I'm happy to put it in the chat as well later. But building off of that notion of courtesy, good communication is ultimately good relationship building. And we don't often think about our articles, the chapters in our dissertations, our theses, and the other documents that we're putting together as relationship building. But I think it helps if you do. In part, it makes that editing a little bit easier. So, for example, before starting this recording, I asked the folks in the room, like, okay, so what are your interests in editing, and how's that working for you? So that I can go through and I can edit the slides, and I'm not going to cover everything because we have way too many slides in this, which I think is a good exercise. Like, too many slides, have to cut it down. But I can only do that by being in relationship to the folks who are here. Jay Sullivan, if you're not familiar with him, you don't necessarily need to be, but I like his work on communication, in part because, again, going to that keep it simple or simply said. I've referenced him once before in thinking about how it is that we communicate with others and keeping our focus on the other person, on our audience. And we'll talk about that within the context of the rhetorical situation in a moment. But the goal is to have you focus less on yourself and what it is that you know, which sounds ironic given that in graduate school you're required to, especially at the master's level, but at your exam level, to demonstrate how much you know. But your goal is really to focus on the other person and what do they need to know that you know. As soon as you can make that jump, it really helps you go through and edit for clarity and concision. You might have all of this information out there, you've dumped it all out in your first draft, everything that you know about the topic, right? But then it really is focusing on the other person and that kind of macro editing and kind of big picture. What does that person need to know? And then it'll help you be able to identify what does that person need. Jay Sullivan, he's talking in general communications terms, but he's, basically, what am I trying to convey? If you start there, that's focusing on knowledge and yourself. If you shift it and ask, what does he or she or whoever's reading the email or attending this meeting, what do they need to know? What do they hope to get out of what it is that I'm telling them? It puts you in a much greater position of authority over the subject matter. It puts you in a much greater position of being able to, what I would call, wield the field, that you can communicate with them and tell them what it is that you think that they need to know. Doesn't mean that you're going to be perfect, and it doesn't mean that your message will always land. You'll get feedback from others who will tell you when it doesn't land, but then at least you have some surety of what it is that, and confidence in what you had said, and then go back and then with confidence revise for greater clarity and concision. So this kind of iterative back and forth in academic and research writing is just so important and necessary, that it's about building relationships ultimately. This doesn't look like we're building relationships, though, right? This is when we talk about the rhetorical situation. This is where writing gets really abstract. And some of you may have heard about this and some of you might not. You're not required to. But what it does, and what this visual does, is it gives us kind of a way to lay out that relationship, the relationship between the subject or the knowledge, the kind of content that you're going to be writing about, the writer and who you are, and the audience and the reader. This goes all the way back to Aristotle, who articulated that kind of notion of rhetoric, and that you would have these kind of three dynamic processes in exchange. But there's some sort of exigence, the reason why the writer is writing about the subject, which connects to the context of who or what is the context in that the conversation is going to be happening, the purpose, right, of what they're seeking from the audience. And notice that purpose is not just it's still connected in some ways to what the writer is writing about the subject and why it's important. But that purpose is not only directed to the importance, it's also directed to the audience person, the audience. And that's going to help you be able to edit and kind of determine, what do you keep, what do you get rid of? And by thinking about that audience, right? You're connecting there. And then here you've got this other kind of middle place that we're going to focus on next, which is the text itself that you're writing or editing, that is housed within a genre, right? In this right to publish, we're talking just largely about academic articles, but we do occasionally talk about other genres. And so we'll talk a little bit about a proposal as well today. And then it's how that subject is presented to the audience. So you're always keeping those readers in mind, and you don't want to do your head in. So you don't want to keep your readers so much in mind that you can't think about, or you get nervous about what you're writing. You want to keep them just enough in mind so that you're being courteous, that you're being kind to them, right? I'm going to go to just a quick example of genre and thinking about the differences in genre. So this is a guidebook that I have in the office, and if anybody's interested in it, I'm happy to loan it out or to have a conversation with you about it. I love the title. It's the only grant writing book you'll ever need. It's just like a great title. It grabs your attention. We're going to go to their first pages as well to take a look at how they're grabbing their audience. But this is a title that includes the reader in it. It says this is the only grant writing book that you will ever need. What's interesting in Karsh and Fox's approach is that they're talking to people who are writing for nonprofit grants or in social studies in social areas. They're not talking explicitly to people in your area. It might overlap with some. They're not specifically talking to NIH or NSF writers, for example. So they give it the only grant writing book you'll ever need is a little bit of an overstatement, but it's a kind of this broad catch-all term. In this first kind of chapter, I want to take a look at this, where these are their first sentences. In the best of times, in the worst of times, and in all the time in between, there are always grants to be had, and we hope that will never change. For each of the previous 4 editions, we've focused our interviews on grant makers' approaches to specific calamities current at the time. 9/11, hurricanes Katrina and Sandy, the economic meltdown of 2008, the ensuing financial crisis that we thought would affect the ability of grants from federal, state, and local governments from private foundations and corporations. We had a strong hunch. In fact, we thought it was obvious that catastrophes of all kinds would diminish grant seekers' chances of obtaining more routine funding. And not surprisingly, we learned from grant makers that this hunch was correct. For the current edition, we decided to take a more holistic view of grantsmanship, to look not only at the calamities and catastrophes, but to place the grants process in the context of the political, cultural, and social environment as well. As we write, the scene is tumultuous globally as well as nationally, immigration, healthcare, right? Okay. So you get the sense of, and just think about, these are their opening paragraphs. We've got a paragraph and a half. They address their reader in the title of their book. And they draw, I love this kind of, in the best of times and in the worst of times. For those of you who may have read A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. This is the very beginning of that it's a famous line from the beginning of that novel, a 19th century Victorian novel. But they play with that. But in doing so, they immediately then bring us into, this is multiple editions. So they're on the 5th edition of this book. What have they covered before? They don't belabor it. They don't spend a lot of time on it. They just get to it pretty quickly and sum it up for us. Because picture us as readers reading through this. If they're like telling us all the little details of everything that they're going to change in this book, already we're snoozing, right? So they just kind of give it to us in a quick summary, what they had a strong hunch about. So they keep us moving about, oh, they're thinking about this in new ways, what that was obvious, and catastrophes diminishing. So notice how the language here and the storytelling that they're telling us about their prior editions, their revisions in this 5th edition, why it is that we should keep reading, all of it is written in a way that keeps us moving forward. They do have, if you think about the verbs that they're using, we hope, we focused, we thought, we had a strong hunch, we had is a weakish verb, but we learned, we decided. All of those kind of connectors make it so that the relationship that we have as a reader to this text, to what they've written, it's clear. We also feel like we have a relationship, if we go back, it feels like we have this relationship, or that Karsh and Fox kind of understand who we are, and that this whole thing, that what we'll ever need, they'll be able to satisfy our needs. So I like this as an example of thinking about how when you go through the editing and you're clarifying and creating a kind of clearer argument for your readers, how it is that you can, by keeping them in mind, work with language in ways that is compelling and keeps them moving through the document. So there's plenty of information to be had, right? All the things that they're taking out in their new edition, but they're not covering it in ways that are boring. They're covering it in ways that kind of give us the context of why they've made those changes. So I'm going to take you through a quick comparison as well. This is on a grant proposal, but also a article that came out of that grant funding. And it's in part because, excuse me, when we're thinking about our audiences and genre, and we're thinking about our editing and targeting those audiences, we need to be aware of what the different genre and the different documents are intended to do. I mean, on the one hand, it's pretty obvious, like a grant proposal is not the same thing as an article. And yet, how in the world do you start, going about crafting that and then editing for those readers? Grant proposals have committees. Many of you are writing to committees currently, right? And so you are familiar with that kind of process where you have to please multiple people. And then the article doesn't mean that it hasn't gone through peer review and also had to, please multiple folks, but its editorial process and its goal is different. It's not going to stop with the proposal, right, and then being funded or not funded. It's actually going to go out and it's going to continue to build knowledge. And the readers for that are going to be different. They're going to be experts in the field rather than just a small panel of folks. And it makes a difference in how it is that these are written. So let's take a look quickly at some of the language, the first language of the overview page on that NSF proposal, which is, and this is in geosciences, by the way. So this is a geoscience project, and it relates to Hurricane Irma and the forests after that. So Hurricane Irma resulted in extensive wind and water damage across Florida. Damage to trees and the urban forest was also widespread, with uprooted and downed trees reported, as well as severe defoliation and limb loss. Preliminary data from the storm, however, suggests a spatial heterogeneity in the damage, even when considering differences in wind speed with patterns related to landscape context, species composition, and community socioeconomic factors. Urban forests provide a wide variety of ecosystem services, including decreased pollution, flood risk, and climate mitigation and carbon sequestration. Moreover, they are an ideal system to study disturbance impacts as proxy for future climate conditions. While destructive Hurricane Irma offers an opportunity to increase our knowledge about the response of trees and urban forests to hurricane disturbance. Understanding the resistance and resilience of urban forests to disturbance is necessary to increasing our knowledge about how ecosystems will correspond to a change in climate regimes, et cetera, into the future. Okay, so the goal of this proposed research is to understand, excuse me, how windstorm-caused tree failure relates, windstorm-caused tree failure, excuse me, relates to urban forest structure and socio-ecological contexts. And that they hypothesize that storm damage will be lower in areas with higher tree density and native tree cover, right? And so this is they've got their hypotheses, but they've also got this tremendous amount of context here that is very tightly pulled together. They're talking about Hurricane Irma and its damage. Automatically, by setting that up, they have something of the content that is already compelling and concrete, but it's their damage to trees, the damage, right, that gives us the idea of what they're talking about. Preliminary data is a little bit broad, but the heterogeneity in that damage and wind speed. So they give us some things that we can hold on to so that by the time they get down to, well, this is what we're thinking and this is what our hypotheses are, we have a much kind of greater idea of the specifics that they're going to be talking about. Without even going through the rest of their proposal, we can kind of see how important this study might be. In the article, and we're going to just start down here and just talk about this a bit, the focus is going to be different, but notice that how different their approach is. This will go to some of the things that we've talked about with storytelling and writing science with Joshua Schimmel and his kind of recommendations and different approaches that we've worked with the OCAR system on openings and conflict and what am I thinking? Action and resolution are his OCAR. But in proposals, it works slightly different, right? He says, first, what you want is the action. And so we're going to get a sense of that. So here's in the introduction we're going to have something that's a little bit more broad, a little bit more open, and it's not going to be the action. We're going to actually go through the characters. Who are the players in this kind of opening space? Urban forests are a valuable part of the infrastructure within cities. These forests hold distinct differences from rural forests in the degree in which they impact and are impacted by human activity. This leads to difference in stress conditions, maintenance, valuation, and urban environments. Humans manipulate water and nutrients as well. Okay, so we get this kind of broader sense of who are the players within the context, so that we can set that up for the article. I'm just going to go to the abstract so that we can kind of get a sense of what they found and what they worked with. So research that illuminates causes of urban forest storm damage is valuable for planning and management. Boom, now we have a sense of their audience. Who's going to be reading this? People who need to know about urban planning and management and working with forests, and in particular, understanding storm damage. However, logistical and safety concerns often delay post-storm surveys in urban areas. The surveys may include observations with unverified sources of damage. While this uncertainty is often ignored, it can make up a high proportion of the number of damaged trees. The goal of this research was to improve understanding of techniques for modeling storm damage in urban forests. Using urban forest storm damage inventories collected in Florida post-Hurricane Irma, we tested how different imputation methods, modeling procedures, and damage frequency levels could impact the overall model results. We utilized machine learning algorithms, et cetera, and generalized linear models. We found that GLM and RF models gave overall unbiased predictions. And so notice where we go pretty quickly. We've got this kind of broader context of what's being studied, but ultimately the very story and kind of who are going to be the main characters moving forward, particularly with the methodology, those are all like how it is that they identify and put together their models. And it's the models that future researchers are going to be building off of. The difference in how these are put together points to us, different readers. One is a group of funders people who are scientists who may not be experts in exactly the same field, but have enough field-specific knowledge in their own right that they can make a decision on whether something's worth funding or not. The other group of readers, the relationship here is really towards like, we are people who you're in conversation with, that we will be working with, and these are models that can be helpful for our conversations. If we look and think about like how it is that they're using their subjects and verbs, we can see things in this abstract that help us a little bit more. So it's research is the subject, for example, is valuable. This is a weak-ish verb, but where they take us is here to concerns, delay, right? Surveys, and just surveys may include observations, and that it can make up. And the goal of this research was to improve. So we've got some decent-ish verbs, but some really weak ones as well. When we get down here, notice that when they get to what they specifically did, notice what happens to the verbs. They shift, they become much clearer and much more precise. So we tested, so this is what they did. So they tested, we utilized, generalized models. These gave us something. They influenced, damage influenced something. Something did not impact. That's okay. And then there was variation. Now we're back to something a little bit more general, but models identified, these findings suggest. So you can see that, and you can hear through the subjects and verbs as we move through that abstract, not through the whole piece, but that they're able to identify kind of actions in key places. And those are the things that are going to be the meat and potatoes of this article. All right. So when we do our macro editing, and when we talk macro editing, we're talking like big picture. So we're going to talk about macro and we're going to talk about micro, and how it is that you can use your genre considerations and thinking about your arrangements of ideas, keeping those audience, your readers in mind. Who's going to be reading? We talked a little bit already about identifying gaps and eliminating redundancies. And we do that, of course, as a kindness to our readers. That micro editing, though, rather than the big picture, micro editing happens at the sentence level. It's about mechanics, it's that grammar, the word choice. So we talked about both, by the way. We talked about the overall structure of kind of the abstract, for example, and kind of takes us from some sort of introduction to through methods, and then of course down to findings. But on that sentence level, you can also track it through the subjects and the verbs, right, as we heard. Proofreading, that's the last stage. That's your kind of most micro of the editing processes, that proofreading where you're going for spelling errors, punctuation errors, and typos. What happens if you're asking for feedback to help you with your editing processes, if you have not yet proofread what you've sent off to someone, and there are spelling errors or there are punctuation errors or there are typos in there, people become hyper fixated on those, and they will tend to give you micro editing feedback instead of macro if you're looking for big structure. So let's say your early stages in a document, writing out your article, you just need you just need to get a sense of like, is this landing? Am I kind of putting things in order in the ways that my reader can understand? And so you're asking for something like big picture genre considerations. Does this sound like a good article for this particular journal, maybe? Or is this arrangement of ideas? Is this flowing logically for you? Can you follow this? And what more often than not will happen is if you don't give clear directions to your reviewers who are giving you just quick feedback, they'll focus on the micro. And I don't know why that is, but we have a tendency, I have a tendency to do it too. I'm like, ooh, this right here is off. Let me circle that word. This is the incorrect version. So I start harping on the little details that seem to be off. The only way at early stages in a document, if you're looking for macro feedback in order to create some clarity and concision and focus on your point for your readers, the only way that micro kind of feedback would be helpful is if in that word choice, it's totally throwing off what you're trying to do and what you're explaining at the big picture level. So it's really helpful if you set up anyone who's giving you feedback, and that includes your faculty advisors, anyone on your committee, even people you find intimidating, just make sure that they know what kind of feedback that you're asking for. What that does is it allows for them to give you feedback on what you've asked for, but you can then be the person who's keeping your readers in mind. You're not defaulting and asking your advisor to be the one who keeps your readers in mind. However, and I'm going to stop for just a moment, it may be if you are a novice, right? If this is the first time you've written an article for a journal, if this is the first time you've ever written a chapter or a grant proposal or whatever document you're writing, that it may be really, really helpful to have the guidance from your faculty advisor to show you how to narrow things down so that you can see what it is that the readers that they know so well and whom you are just going to be learning about and getting acquainted with, how do you see them too? So you will learn through that process of getting feedback from your advisors and from other people in the field whom you share your writing with. Early stages, middle stages, and later stages. When you edit, there are some stages that you'll want to be going through. That macro stage is your first kind of broad stage where you're looking at that story and are the parts of the story there. And then later, of course, to the micro level. And the reason you don't start with the micro is because if something's way off in the macro and you take out 3 or 4 pages, if there was a lot of editing and a lot of effort that went into those 3 or 4 pages by other people giving you feedback, and then you're just like, yeah, we need to get rid of it. It can be harder to get rid of it, first of all, because you're like, we put so much effort into it. We want to hang on to it. But also, it just means that it's a waste of time, perhaps, for at least for that kind of editing, that for creating clarity and concision, where ultimately that was going to be excised and taken out. All right. So principles of concision, I really like Nathan Sheffield's work from Duke Graduate School. He's got a tremendous amount of science writing resources and so if you just look up Duke writing or Thompson writing program or Nathan Sheffield, you should come up with some of his resources. He's got great ones if you're looking for sentence level advice on things like passive active voice. That's another workshop that I pull from his work. But his principles of concision are geared specifically towards science writers. And he says, not unlike Helen Sword, basically what you want to do is you want to omit the needless words, the excessive hedging, and just go for the simpler words, which is tricky, as we know, because if we learn a really fancy term, we want to be able to showcase that we know that fancy term. And yet, preferring the simpler word is helpful for your readers. You can still use the fancy term if it's necessary for you to be able to communicate something of a nuance, or why is that term right there so important? But oftentimes, we wind up with complex terms that are, these kind of broad generalizations housed within a specific word. And we're going to cut to nominalizations in just a moment. And that's where we're going to go after this. And using simple subjects so that you can have, as we pointed out in the other kind of samples, clear subjects, we, right, approached. So this study suggests kind of thing, clear, simple subjects, and then using the adjectives and adverbs frugally. And we're probably not going to have enough time to spend on any of that, but I just want to jump ahead real quick. But she talks about nominalizations as zombie nouns, which I just think is hilarious. And she says that they will invade and kill lively prose. So if you're having a difficult time with your language kind of taking, like, big terms taking over and they're not concrete, they're kind of these abstracted nouns, they get created by taking these endings. So you can look for these endings on some of the words that are specialty words in your field. ION or TION, MENT, ITY, TY, or NES. And often these are you add these to usually a verb or an adverb, something that's lively, and you connect ION or TION, and all of a sudden becomes another thing. It becomes a noun. But again, it's kind of like the undead. It doesn't do what you think it's going to do. So here are some examples. So when we talk about destabilization, really it's to destabilize, or here invasion can destabilize. But if you make it an ION, now you've got a noun. So the example is ecosystem destabilization can be the consequence of invasion. Oof. So there's a lot of IONs. Once you start to hear that, it's hard for readers to pick up on what you're really talking about. Basically, it's invasions can destabilize ecosystems. It's as simple as that. Notice that when you keep it destabilize not as the noun, but as the verb, then invasion, which is another ION, to invade, but invasion is not connected to destabilization, right? And so just know that your writing can make it much more clear if you take out a lot of these IONs or the TIONs. Here, let's go down to analysis. An analysis of main effect and interaction was conducted. So, we can hear sentences like this all the time, and it's grammatically correct, but it's much clearer to keep it in the verb form, which is the blue form, as we analyzed. We analyzed main effects and interactions. Now, you still have interaction, right, to interact, but as long as you aren't listing off a lot of zombie nouns, and if you feel like, if you get a feedback that your writing is really dense and you tend to list these off, it's just something for you to be aware of and see where it is that you cannot do that, and start crafting a little bit more lively prose, usually by changing up how you're using things as verbs. This one comes from Sheffield's Duke graduate program. And you can think about, these are all actions that are clear, and you can see how they would drive our being able to see what's happening: to regulate, to analyze, to occur, to understand, to investigate, to delineate, to perform. These are all clear as actions that something or being, right, is taking. When you create a nominalization out of to regulate to regulation, all of a sudden it becomes this big, broad thing of regulations that kind of is echoey. And you have to ground that nominalization then in something specific so that your reader can understand when you're talking about regulation, what are you specifically talking about within that? Is what's being regulated, and how is it operating within that system? Same thing to analyze versus an analysis. When you talk about analysis, you're talking about something that's like big and overarching and done by many, many, many people across many, many, many disciplines and many, many different projects. So you have to kind of pull it together, and who's doing the analysis. And by creating that concrete language, it allows for you to create a better connection to your readers so that they understand more fully and easily what it is that you are talking about. All right, and I think that's my last kind of skip. I don't want to go through. Yeah, if you want me to talk about prepositional phrases at some point in time in the future, I am happy to do that. But I'm going to skip down to our Q&A and just open it up for some conversation about the relationship that between creating a document of clarity and concision structurally and how it is that that's operating and connecting you to your audience.